The government's use of a VIP lane to supply personal protective equipment during the pandemic has been ruled unlawful by the High Court. Mrs Justice O'Farrell said the government was, quote, in breach of the obligation of equal treatment. Over 32 billion items of PPE worth a combined £14 billion were bought through VIP contracts, with one of Michael Gove's Tory leadership donors, David Miller, amongst those to win a contract worth millions. Well, joining us now, campaign manager at the Taxpayers Alliance, that's Danielle Boxall. Danielle, thanks so much for coming in. Appreciate your time. VIP lane, what do we mean?
Well, so this was a lane that was set up to sort of prioritise and skip the queue, essentially, in the public procurement process of accessing PPE. So the Department for Health initially set up an 8-stage process. But what we know from the National Audit Office is that there were actually about 70 contracts that were put through and ended up succeeding in getting contracts before this 8-stage process got put into place. And then after that, they also created this VIP lane for people that had contacts or well-known businesses that they thought might be able to provide the supplies that they were looking for ahead of the 8-stage process. So they sort of effectively skipped the queue there and went in and got these contracts.
There's a danger here, isn't there? In the cool light of High Court jurisprudence, we forget the panic of the time, don't we? We think back to that time when it was a case of, we don't care where you get the PPE from, just get hold of the stuff, because people are dying and more will die if you don't get hold of it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it was a really difficult, point in our history. It was an unprecedented crisis. But, if we look back to, other times in history or recent history even where we've had public procurement that hasn't worked out so well, the government really should have learned from this. I mean, take 2018 when we had Carillion. We had millions of pounds worth of contracts when we knew that Carillion was about to go bust. We knew that they were about to collapse. And yet the government continued these contracts instead of retendering them. What they should have done is retendered them immediately and found out better companies to provide those projects. But instead, the taxpayer was left on the hook for billions of pounds of contracts that didn't end up, that weren't successful.
I'm a huge fan of the Taxpayers Alliance. I think you draw attention to all kinds of hideous taxpayer-funded profligacy. I think you're backing the wrong horse on this one, simply because to liken a tendering process that's happening in a moment of parliamentary calm and a moment when the nation doesn't face a moment of crisis, as it did in the spring of 2020, is incomparable. You're comparing a panic situation with one when it's business as usual, and the two things are incomparable.
Yeah, but of course, taxpayers will still be questioning why their money was wasted on, projects that were...
They will, Danielle, but there'll be more understanding because they understand the essential equation, which was if you didn't get your hands on the PPE really quickly, and heaven knows people like me and people like me all through the media were screaming for the government to do everything it possibly could to get ahead of the Chinese, get ahead of the Italians. People were wearing bin liners, for heaven's sake. It's very easy to think in the cool light of day that processes were not followed in the way we'd like to have seen them followed. It was a moment of crisis. Go easy on them.
Yeah, of course, but there was still millions and billions of pounds worth of money that was wasted on ineffectual PPE. And the government, the Public Health England was set up to prepare the UK, to prepare the country for a potential pandemic. Of course, PPE wasn't part of their sort of requirement. It wasn't part of their remit. But they still could have done more to sort of prepare us for this kind of situation. And I think this is a moment where we could really learn a lesson about what the government should be doing and what public bodies should be doing to prepare us for future crises.
And finally, I suppose a moment to think ahead when perhaps, because now, surely, we recognise, don't we, this is probably not the last pandemic that will face us in the course of our lifetimes. The government can do things in terms of making sure it warehouses future PPE. And there's always a danger that people then say, why did you go to all that trouble and spend tens of millions of pounds on PPE we never use? You get the same argument about things like, tractors bought to clear runways when it snows once every 10 years really heavily to close an airport. There's that constant balance, isn't there, between what government needs to do prudentially for the worst case scenario and making sure it's also spending our cash, and it is our cash, properly.
Yeah, of course. And, we always want to see that value for money for taxpayers that should be the aim of any government in any public procurement setting. And I think there's going to be a real conversation now about, these sort of just-in-time type systems versus, stockpiling or, having more supply at home and, making our own supplies even. And I think that's a real debate that we need to be having in the next few years about how much value for money the two systems provide.
Yeah, and we can all agree that single-use plastic ended up being quite useful, didn't it? Danielle Boxall, thanks very much indeed.